We have selected the East End for VIE's book club. So I'm really excited that I got the opportunity to not only read your book, but I'm writing your review for everyone else to see and to fall in love with. So
Oh, I really appreciate it.
it is recording. Sorry. We just always have to make sure that we're recording and that we're not just having just this really awesome conversation, just you and I, but that we actually want to share it with the world. So first off, I wanted to, I don't want to spoil anything, so I was going to have you kind of give us a synopsis of what the book, is all about and what you're most excited about as you introduce it to the world, so to speak. This is your debut album. You're also a memoirist and a poet, which definitely you can really appreciate that in the way that it's written, because I would personally categorize it more as although it's a thriller, it is literary, but it's not. What I loved about the East End is that although it reads beautifully and it definitely has those literary sentences, it's not heavy. Although it is dark and gritty, but it's not so heavy that it's slow. It's actually a very fast-paced read, and a large part of that, I believe, is just the content and the storyline. So you can explain it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everything that you've said. Yeah, people have categorized it as a literary thriller, so I'm glad about that, because I wanted to write it. I always want to write a literary novel, I guess. I mean,
right.
If you were to break that down, that comes to me down to character, and then like taking time with the sentences so that it's not just a basic story being told. So the language is satisfying, the characters have a lot of depth, but the thriller pacing, I guess, is what people have responded to. Like you said, a lot of people have said that they picked up the book expecting to read a chapter or two, and then they just couldn't put it down. And that's the nicest thing to hear when you're an author, I think.
I mean, I will tell you that has been the overwhelming takeaway from everybody that I've spoken to that has read this book, is that you really need to pick this book knowing that you're going to spend some hours there in that one space. I was talking to a friend of mine. I'm like, it might be a good idea for you to pick up some eye drops, because you are so engrossed in the storyline, your eyes don't even want to blink, because you do such an amazing job of making this novel with a certain tone of cinematography, if that makes any sense, because your descriptions are so vivid and so detailed that you really get the sense that, one, you have lived there, and we'll go into that in a little bit, but also that you are right there with the characters.
Yeah, if you'd like me to give the brief synopsis.
Please do. My overexcitement is cutting you off. I apologize.
It's always a little tricky to try and sum the book up just in a couple of sentences, because, as you know, it's multiple points of view. So there is a teenage character, Corey, which the book opens with him, and he's a working class kid in the Hamptons, just like I was. So the book opens with him breaking into some of the mansions on Dune Road in the Hamptons, which he does just for the thrill of being able to break in and then get away with it. He decides to break into his mother's boss's estate right away, and that's loosely based on my own experience, not breaking into houses. I never did.
I was going to say, really?
But my mother worked for a really, really wealthy family in Southampton when I was maybe between the ages of 10 and 19 or 20. So I got to see how these other people lived. Like, we went to the estate when they weren't home, but also later on I worked there for one summer when I was 19. So the Corey character is really loosely based on me. And then the other point of view character, Gina, is at least based on the job that my mother had. It's a woman who works at a billionaire's estate. And she's hitting bottom with alcohol and pills. So that's some of the dramatic conflict for her. And then Leo Sheffield is the homeowner. He's the billionaire. And he's got a huge secret, which is like the source of all of his conflicts. Uh, Part of which is that he's cheating on his wife with a much, much younger man. And they end up back at the estate one night when Corey is there. And everything pretty much takes off from that point with the thriller pacing because someone dies on the property. So it doesn't really give away much by saying that because you don't know who dies on the property, but
Right.
all these different people have varied points of views on things. Sometimes they have partial knowledge, so there's a lot of misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of stress for all of them, and they all collide at this estate just before Memorial Day weekend's about to start, when all the guests and family members are supposed to arrive.
Well, and it's encapsulated in that weekend. So again, it adds to that speed,
Mm-hmm.
because everything is happening quickly. And what I loved about it, I mean, I love so much about it, but those 3 points of view, like you said, it's just human nature that when we're going to go into a scenario and only see our side,
Oh yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love how each character has their own perspective. And that misunderstanding is both believable as a reader as you're going through it. But it also really, what struck me, it really shows that maturity arc throughout the novel of where these characters start out and how they know each other. Because oftentimes we know each other by title, right?
Yep.
Like here's the billionaire and here is the pool boy and here is the
Mm-hmm.
son or the friend, and there's these categories, and it is our human instinct to build these stories in our head of who we're going to meet, and yet when we meet them they show up to be much more complex.
Oh yeah, that's the most satisfying part of writing to me. And for this novel, I think the surprise that I found that was really satisfying
Yeah.
was to realize how much I cared about Leo, the billionaire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was a point where I wondered how was I going to connect with this character enough so that he wouldn't become a two-dimensional, easy person to dislike. The way that I grew up, I had a big chip on my shoulder as a working class poor kid growing up in the Hamptons.
Mm-hmm.
It was a pretty extreme disparity between what my mom, who was a single mom, went through to just scrape by, versus the people that came out for vacation for the summer. Some of the wealthiest people in the world come out to the Hamptons, and when you're a poor kid there, it was really, really good for me, I think, to think in depth about how all of us have some sort of really deep conflicts. And Leo's, I felt for him. He's been forced to live a lie his entire life, which you'll find out more about as you read the book. There's a little bit of backstory threaded through that explains just why he couldn't come out of the closet for all those years. He's almost 60 years old, and when the book begins, it's almost like he's finally to the point in his life that he can be his true self.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a tragedy that ensues that completely derails that. So,
well, what I found to piggyback on what you're saying is that what I got from it from the very beginning is that everyone in a way is in the shadows or closeted,
yeah.
right? It's like, and everyone is pushing boundaries. And I love that about the book because it's kind of, again, going back to that human desire to be seen and to be known and to be, just free of all of that, all of those pressures that come from either being poor or being a billionaire as well. There's a line that you wrote, towards the middle of the novel, and it said how the billionaire, it lived in a world where most of his friends, may have a heart attack or two.
Yep.
That's not, so that really kind of speaks to there's these pressures that are coming in, not just from the working class, but also the expectations that this 1% socialite world really is trying to jam down their throats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another theme that was really important to me is how Gina's character, especially in terms of her addiction, when she ends up at her first AA meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and just the anxiety that she's experiencing. A lot of her impetus to potentially get sober is because she has two sons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I really hope that people connect with Gina's character and can empathize if they wouldn't have already, maybe with somebody who's going through those kinds of struggles. And really, all of the main point of view characters have issues with substances as like coping mechanisms. So it was,
Absolutely. I would say, go ahead, sorry.
well, it was just important for me to really humanize that, or give it multiple faces, I guess you could say, so that people could identify or connect with these characters, if only through someone that they know, somebody from their family or a friend. They might understand that person just a little bit more after reading the book.
To me, addiction really, I mean, I would argue that it's a main character in the book. And what I mean by that is, much like what you said, there's so many different facets to it, because there's also that codependence and that support system that rallies around, you know, a person that is struggling with substance abuse or drug abuse. And so there's a whole ecosystem that is created, and these characters lived within those ecosystems, and yet addiction as a whole was this equalizer, because it was,
Yeah.
you know, alcohol and drugs, it really is it's a form of us dealing with our feelings, or escaping from our feelings, or enhancing our feelings.
Yep.
And that really showed through the novel itself. It was obvious that you did not shy away from strong scenes that took you down that dark tunnel.
Well, thank you. Yeah, like some of my friends, I'm in recovery myself. I'm really open about that. But a lot of my friends who are in recovery, who have read the book, they said that they really, really felt that that rang true to them, Gene's experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really gratifying to hear that. I wanted to make do that right.
Yeah, I mean, when I, you know, you go into those scenes, and oftentimes these scenes are moments that just, if you were sober, you want to go out and grab a drink, let alone if you're going through a tremendous crisis.
Yeah.
You know, and as you see this beautiful relationship between Gina and her son Corey, I love the way that Corey's sensitivity, and maybe this speaks to, you know, just your own maturity and how you related to Corey's character, is that there was this real sensitivity there, and you see it. Corey also writes poetry,
Yep.
and although he's much shy about it, he didn't write a book. But I love the way that, you know, you put yourself in the mind of a high school boy.
Mm-hmm.
And is that not the most raw time of your life? It's this really interesting space and time as individuals, I believe, where we're able to experience all emotions, but we don't have the means to go out and live your life. So you're stuck between where your family is and who you want to become as you grow older.
Yep.
And you very much get that sense of strife in Corey, where he wants to protect his mother and his brother, but he feels stuck in this position where, you know, he's serving the people that allow her mother to feed him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that especially the boys that I grew up with, all of us as a group, we were really nice, friendly people, but we had so much pent up emotion that we didn't know what to do with. Right. So a lot of times that just becomes like absolute self destruction, like with drinking and drugs and just, you know, fairly reckless, almost adrenaline junkie type behaviors, you know, just to feel something completely new or different, a big distraction from what we were actually going to feel otherwise. Yeah. So I definitely. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, when you look back at this world that you painted for us, does it look different than you remembered it now?
Well, it was interesting because during the book tour for the East End, I went back to Eastern Long Island for the first time in 15 years. I actually had moved away to live in Portland, Oregon, and I was out there for years. And then my mother and brother, who are my closest family members, they live out in Oregon as well. So I didn't really have much reason to go back to Long Island for a long time. And honestly, it was really familiar, but at the same time, it looked different than what I remember to a certain extent. It looked like a much quieter, kind of like sleepy, bucolic country setting, like the main
I
roads.
think that's the point when they manicure all those lawns and make it all pristine.
Yeah. But I feel like when I was growing up there, it felt like the way that you said that you felt as you read the East End is the way that I felt a lot as a teenager. Like that everything was just so intense all the time.
Mm-hmm.
When really someone else's perspective would be like, you live in such a calm, peaceful, beautiful place. What could you possibly have to be like full of tension about? But yeah, I think that that was just part of the whole adolescent experience too.
So let me ask, as far as your poetry, you've written a book. It's Rain on Fire.
Yep, A Meditation on Fire.
I'm sorry, Meditation on Fire. That's another book, but which is also a really good book. Meditation on Fire, the poetry book. And you know, it's interesting. As I read the book, I'm the type of reader that reads with a highlighter because I'm constantly just highlighting beautiful sentences and trying to study them, that type of thing. That's the nerd in me. I can't help it.
Mm-hmm.
When I read the East End, I heard the East End first, and it was so great because the narrator just has that voice that also adds to the tension, you know?
Amazing, right? Angelo Di Loretto. He really he did
Phenomenal.
a phenomenal job. Yeah.
He did you right. He did you right because it was gripping from beginning to end, you know. And then I went back and I started reading the book as like a second go around, and then I found myself again just like being just so wrapped on like how quickly it read. I really had to kind of like sit down and go back and be like, oh, okay, like here's the moment where my breath kind of caught. You're so deliberate when it comes to your words, and you're not afraid of long sentences that, you know, kind of like take you like a waltz a little bit outside of that structure. And yet it's so clear and concise. Did you get that from, do you believe that you're a poet first and a novelist second? Or were you writing poetry while you were writing the book? I'm curious as to how you crafted that kind of balance.
Well, I would just say I'm definitely a novelist first, but it took me quite a long time to get this debut novel like 100% in place.
Okay.
So I wrote a lot of poetry over the years. And I just feel like between writing poetry, creative nonfiction, especially memoir, and long form fiction more than anything, I've written some short stories, but I'm really more of a long form storyteller.
Okay. Is that easier or harder for you?
I think it's much, much easier for me to write in the long form. It just takes a long time. That's all.
It's interesting to me because I always think of poetry as every word, every beat, every line counts, you know, whereas when you write a novel, you can, you know, you have longer sessions of just fully explaining, you know, a feeling and an emotion and a situation.
Yeah, that's what I love about it. I mean, I love poetry for the opposite, really, like that you can convey a mood maybe almost as if like it's a lightning bolt. Like all of a sudden you read something and 30 seconds later you feel something. And hopefully it's a deep feeling or an intense feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the focus on language with poetry has definitely informed my fiction a lot. So I really appreciate that you've said all that because I do care about every word of every sentence.
No, and you get that. You definitely get that as you read because it's beautiful, and yes, it is poetic, but it's punchy. You know?
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that because I don't want the language to distract from the story. Mm-hmm. So it's a really tricky balance sometimes. Like I want the sentence to have some sort of like musicality or some sort of Just a surprising image, maybe a metaphorical turn. But I don't want someone to be pulled out of the story. That's when you know that you're probably going to have to revise a bit to Kill Your Darlings to just make it a little bit more straightforward to convey the story. But yeah, a lot of that is the last rounds of revision, the fine tuning, editing, and that's my favorite part, honestly.
Is it?
Yeah, yeah. First drafts, looking at a blank page is the hardest thing for me by far now. Even if I've planned it a lot, I think that I love thinking of it almost like as if it's like if you could somehow focus a film like from 99% clarity to 100%, it's that last little bit that everything just sharpens and comes to life. I love that. Like, it just feels like every moment is so well spent then. A lot of the earlier phases are exploration, and that's great too. There's lots of great surprises that can happen, but you can also end up down some tangents. And I know for most of the novelists that I've met, we've all written 50, 100, 200 pages that didn't end up in the final manuscripts. You know, maybe that's in bits and pieces that it adds up to a whole lot like that. But yeah, it's a much.
So that was one of my questions for you. Was were there scenes that you loved or darlings that you had to let go of in order to make it, you know, make a word count that made sense, or again, just that like that quick beat that it has, because you get that this book had to have been edited because it is fast, you know, and if you don't go in tangents, everything is very purposeful in there, is the sense that I got. So were there characters, scenes?
Oh, it evolved over, I probably spent about 3 years total on the book. It's hard to say because I started it, then I shifted to publishing the poetry book actually and writing some of the memoir, and then I came back to the novel. And but I would say I actually had to add a few parts just to balance out the multiple points of view, and some of that I did with Sarah, my agent, who you know, and it was really helpful. We actually like thought it through in terms of like a storyboarding, like to color code the characters chapter by chapter to see how often they were present. And so to find that just the right balance, I actually had to add a couple of short chapters as well as trimming out sections of some other ones. So it really evolved a lot over time, though. There was probably some entire chapters from much earlier on that I did cut. But those additions toward the end really probably helped for that pacing as well.
Right. So your writing process, how are your rituals? Do you have a ritual? Do you have something that you find yourself kind of going in loop in? How do you hear your characters? How did they actually become dialogue?
Oh, that's an interesting question at the end there with the characters and dialogue. I've heard other authors say that there's a certain point where the characters basically tell them what needs to happen.
Right.
I don't know if it's exactly that, but I do think that there's moments where I'm just completely surprised that the character said that because it feels so right, but also I didn't feel like I had any thought going into it. It just happened.
Right.
Those are the best moments. I wish it was more often like that. As far as my process, it's hard to say. I don't really have as consistent a process as maybe some other authors. I don't wake up at the exact same time and work for an exact amount of time or anything like that. Sometimes I work late at night still, but more often than not, it is early in the morning. But sometimes I'll work just for a short period of time for a day. Sometimes I won't work on the book at all that day. And other times I just really feel like compelled to write and work on the book, say, for 7 or 8 hours. So
wow.
The goal is to work on it at least a little bit each day, but sometimes it's
life gets in the way.
Yeah, it could be really minimal one day and then kind of a binge session another day. It just depends where I'm at with the book.
You thought everything out before you start writing, or are you just imagining as you're living life?
Well, with my current novel that's in the works, I'm planning this one out like way more than I did with the East End. The East End, I did a lot of exploration. I started with a standalone section that was through Corey's point of view, and then one that was through Gina's point of view, and later realized I wanted to bring in a billionaire character that Gina worked for. So for a while, it was really like three
But you weren't
separate.
even part of the story to begin with?
Um, very basically, yeah. I would say like I had the one scene I had in my mind is you'll remember this, and this won't really be a spoiler. It's when there's a chase across the lawn with three people.
Yes, that's one of my favorite scenes. Yes.
Well, it's odd, but that scene itself came to me before I really knew much of what else was going to happen with the book. Is just basically that someone would have died, and there would have been a complete and total misunderstanding on at least one person's part. And then one person is chasing that person, and unbeknownst to the first two, there's a third person chasing.
Right.
And there's the full moon, and there's the lake, and there's the mansion, and I really saw it like a sequence in a movie. And then I basically kind of spiraled out from there and built a story all around that one scene. Yeah.
That's interesting because that scene does not necessarily come in the beginning.
No, I think that's about 60 pages in. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
With this latest novel, though, it was an old initial idea that I've completely overhauled. I kept the characters, but I scrapped almost the entire story. And then I wrote it as a screenplay to see the story kind of laid out in a more basic way.
Okay.
With some dialogue and kind of like the basic scenes that would be in there, I think. And so then lately I've just been converting what was in the screenplay to like fleshing all that out as novel pages, which is a lot more work than I thought it would be. When I wrote it out as the screenplay, I figured this is going to be easy. Like I'll just, you know,
like every new project is like, oh, this is going to be so much easier because I already did that.
Yeah.
And then you actually start doing it and you realize.
Yeah, because each time I start to flesh out even one more page from what was the screenplay, it just morphs and blooms, and it tells me that it wants to do something else at a certain point. So, I mean, as much as I plan, I think the surprises are the best part and also the trickiest part.
So let me ask you, how much bravery did it take for you, like where you actually felt like you needed to kind of bring up the courage to start writing in the first place, having grown up in the Hamptons? You know, you worked all kinds of jobs.
Yep.
To see, you know, what the ultra 1% live, and you know where hard work can get you, but you know, writing novels isn't always a sure thing.
Yep.
And it takes time, right? It takes time for you to kind of create this space so that you do work on your craft.
Oh yeah.
Do that when you started writing in earnest?
Oh, well, I knew when I was about 15 or so is the point in time I think that I decided I wanted to be a writer at some point. I went on this long sidetrack tangent until my late 20s when I decided to go back to school full time. As a freshman, I was 29 years old. And then I did 3 degrees in a row, really heavily focusing on creative writing. So I did an MFA and then I did the PhD, both of which I got to work on manuscripts. So I worked on novels a lot, also had some guidance on memoir pages, and also a lot of poetry was written during those times. So I guess in a sense, like I had signed on to just be as like really broke for a lot longer because, you know, when you're in a PhD program, you teach and you earn your funding to live on, which is almost enough to scrape by on. Like, but it also afforded me the time and some direction and deadlines to work on novels to the point where it was so ingrained. This is supposed to be whatever job I do, I'm a novelist at core. So now I'm actually fortunate enough to be starting a teaching position at Georgia College where I'm teaching creative writing. So I'm teaching undergraduate fiction and nonfiction, and I'm teaching a graduate level class in fiction. And so the conversations with students and with colleagues about creative writing just gets me excited about it.
Right.
And I'm always thinking about it. And so when I come home, I'm just going to want to work that much more on my own book.
So all of this schooling, I would imagine, highlights certain strengths that you have as a writer. What do you consider your superpower?
Ah, well, you did warn me you were going to ask this, and I really don't know how to answer that. You're really flattering me, and I appreciate it.
Well, I would say, you know, from reading it, and this is cheating because I shouldn't be giving you the answer, but it's just that beautiful lyrical thriller pacing that you have. I mean, is that something that comes through in most of your writing?
I would say that that has become really something that I'm happy that people have referenced, and so I wouldn't mind being known as an author who does combine the language that you mentioned with like that thriller type pacing. It's a consideration in the novel that I'm currently working on as well. That one takes place in Portland in an extreme winter, so it's pretty much the opposite of the East End as far as the summer setting and the Hamptons. This is back in 2008 in Portland, Oregon. We actually did have a really extreme winter, but I still want to focus on the language in the same way. This one, though, is a much darker story from beginning to end. It focuses a lot on down and outer characters and addiction again, but the two little kids that are in the mix, I think, are like the bright spot, and also the way that some fractured people come together in the end is the hope that basically is the thread that kind of keeps everything, keeps the stakes raised, and that's where that pacing, I think, is going to come in again, is like you just really are going to hopefully care about these people and hope that everything ends up okay for them.
I haven't read it, but if it's anything like the East End, I'm sure you have nothing to worry about, especially if it's darker than the East End and grittier. Let me ask you, as far as your book tour, what surprises have you had from, you know, fans of the book? I love asking this question. It's like a twofold question, but I love asking this question, which is, was there a critique or a quote unquote negative feedback that you actually received that felt more like a compliment?
Oh, well, on the tour, everybody was just really complimentary, which I'm really grateful for. I don't know, that would have been hard if someone in person.
Well, maybe not in person, but I'm saying just reviews and things that came up that, you know, that it's feedback that sounds harsh when in reality you're like, oh, well, actually.
I guess, yeah, I've actually really learned my lesson already. I'm trying not to ever read a review that's not just a glowing 5-star review. Because before the book came out, there were a couple of months where it was just a select number of people who had advanced reader copies. And so I saw a couple of really negative reviews really early on, and I was already a little anxious about the book release and everything. And that threw me off, I'll admit. Yeah, and all of my friends who are debut authors have gone through the same, and so we've been able to sort of support one another, and that's been great.
Well, it's also really nice when the Cosmopolitan, you know, announces that the East End is one of the 14 best books to look out for in summer. To counteract some of those, you know, lower star reviews when you have a whole baseline of readers glowing about your book, telling everybody to go out and get it.
True. Yeah, and that's what I had to keep in mind, is that it's a much higher percentage of people that have said such wonderfully nice things. And that's what I really try to focus on. Because I realize, like, some of my favorite authors' favorite novels, when you look them up and you see what reviews they've received, every book has had at least one 1-star review.
Absolutely.
Some of the most amazing books have gotten a lot of 1- and 2-star reviews, and when you read the reviews, it actually becomes a little bit funny.
Yeah, I heard, I haven't actually looked it up, but that there is like some sort of campaign in Twitter that kind of shows the quotes of these terrible reviews by these super famous authors, you know, and it's.
I read one, well, I think a friend posted one about a Charles Dickens book, A Christmas Carol, I think, that it was really derivative. Like, what is that mean? Derivative of what? Like Dickinson's other, like, I don't know.
Makes all kinds of people make this world go around.
Hmm.
And let me see if I am just skipping over any other questions, because I would hate to end our interview early without making sure that I reviewed everything. As you go into your next projects, what are you most most excited about? You're doing this novel, you said. Are you writing more poetry as well?
Actually, I haven't really been all that motivated to write poetry lately, but then again, like the poems for A Meditation on Fire, a lot of those were written in a fairly short period of time, somewhere between 6 months and a year. I compiled most of the poetry for that book. There were a few old ones that I resurrected and revised, but I think that I just go through phases. Sometimes I'll get a few lines in my head to write a poem, and then I find by the end of the week I've written a few other poems. But for the time being, I think it's going to be all work on the novel. And when the second novel is finished, I'm probably going to go back to the memoir manuscript that I've had on hold, because I have a full manuscript that really I just need to go back to page one, and I think it's it's basically there, but it's really heavy emotional content, like most memoirs. So you have to be in the right mindset to work on that too.
To get it, yeah, to get through it.
Hmm.
And what books do you recommend?
Ooh, well, I think a lot of people that will read this have probably already read the book, but All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, I just feel like it was one of those novels that took me somewhere. And I just mentioned to somebody today on campus that it's very seldom that I'll read a book and forget that I'm reading. Like, I read everything as a writer now, which like I kind of wish that sometimes I could turn off that part of my brain and just experience the book. But All the Light We Cannot
The highlighter down.
Yeah, yeah. All the Light We Cannot See, when I read that book, most of the time I just was completely like immersed in the book. And I really appreciate that when an author can just take me that deep into a story. The two little kids, their perspectives in that book, just there was something about them that was perfect from the beginning all the way through. Recently, I read two books by Devin Murphy as well. His debut novel came out in 2017. It's called The Boat Runner, and that's really phenomenal. That happens to also take place in World War II, which I don't always read books set then, but that one was really interesting. And his other book, Tiny Americans, was really, really well done as well. That one's completely different. It's kind of a family saga that goes from the late 70s to the present day.
So as you're a teacher,
Hmm.
what advice would you have for aspiring writers, authors, memoirists, poets?
Well, the basic advice that I could give that I think would probably be the most helpful is no matter what, if you feel like that this is what you're meant to do, just don't give up. Just keep writing, keep reading. Keep reading is a really key part of that too. The more that I've read, the better that I've, like when you mentioned poetry too, I think read everything. Like read volumes of poetry, read memoirs, read novels, read short stories, read the newspaper, read everything. And also film. I think film and Netflix series and HBO series. I think there's a lot to be said for binge watching shows and rewatching shows and to just
That's to convince me.
yeah, just to appreciate the writing. I mean, like the dialogue and also just the way in which like a show like Breaking Bad, the way that they can like pull me through an entire season because I can't stop. I need to know what's going to happen the next episode and then the next.
The construction, the architecture of that is
Hmm.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
As we conclude the interview, let me ask you, because I did want to delve into your psyche here. With your poetry, not necessarily your poetry, but poems, is there a certain poem that you come back to again and again and again that hits you just right or pulls you out of a funk while you're writing or gives you courage or a poet, maybe not a poem, but a body of work that
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if I have any kind of go-to poem or even a specific poet, but I do think that there have been probably plenty of poems, because you can read a poem in a minute sometimes,
Right.
that have jarred me out of. Sometimes I'll just feel like I'm in a rut in terms of language, whatever I'm working on, and there'll be something so surprising with what that person did. Nick Flynn was actually one of my earlier influences as far as memoir, but then I went and checked out his poetry. And in his first collection, there's a poem about his father who is tilting back a bottle, and Nick, the narrator, is basically wishing that he could keep his father from drinking, but the way that he conveys that scene is just so powerful. So that's just the first one that comes to mind, but there are so many poets. Adrienne Rich, a lot of her stuff I love. Just the language she uses in her collection. Diving Beneath the Wreck. I think that's the title. I hope that I got the title right.
Meditation on Fire. Your book tour there's a couple more dates left, correct?
Well, I'm going to be at the Decatur Book Festival, and that's in Decatur, Georgia, which is just on the edge of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
That's at the end of August. After that, really, the tour events are all finished for now. But then the paperback is going to be released in April, so I may do some more events. I'm not really sure about that yet, though.
And if we have readers that want to get in touch with you, want to stay in touch with what you're working on currently, what's the best place to?
Well, my author website is jasonallenauthor.com, and they can email me through my author website there. But I'm also on social media all over the place. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if they find me on any of those places, I'm happy to add people and respond to a message.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jason, so much. It was
Thank you.
Awesome to get to know you better, to talk about the book.
Same here.
I'm very, very much looking forward to meeting you and discussing this book that I'm already talking about with my friends. So I wish you the best of luck, and I will definitely keep my eye out for that novel you're writing next.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.